Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back in Istanbul. I've been here 6 times already. I have a lot of fascinating memories from my time here. So today I want to talk about the topic of AI risks from the perspective of an academic who has done work with companies such as Google DeepMind and OpenAI. And these companies and research labs, as they call themselves, are the companies who are definitely pushing this revolution to go forward, in particular by designing new type of artificial intelligence systems known as generative AI. One example of that is ChatGPT, many other examples. And I want to talk about how those people in these companies are pushing the thoughts about risks and risk management and how we might kind of react to those kinds of reactions and those kinds of perspectives. And in particular, I want to talk about a specific type of risk that is sort of new in this whole AI discussion, existential risk. So I'm going to talk about what is this risk, how does this notion of risk connect to the more like straightforward conceptions of risk, the way we hear them. Okay, so generative AI, I guess most of you have had experiences with this kind of AI technology, but this is a form of artificial intelligence that kind of like generates some sort of content based on the training on loads of text or audio or video or etc. So again, in ChatGPT, for example, the kind of first generative AI technology that became very popular, like worldwide, you type something and then it's going to output a content. So you say, write me a 4,000-word story about the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and then it can generate you something. It's not great sometimes, but they're working to make it better and better. But this kind of technology has impacted or is transforming all kinds of sectors, from academia to law, to the way like lawyers are practicing things, to the way the geopolitics in the world is being formed, is being kind of transformed, to the way we are writing sci-fi stories. For example, there was this sci-fi publisher called Clarksworth, who always would accept pitches from people who wanted to submit sci-fi stories, people, women, human. But now, because of the use of this generative AI, they stopped accepting sci-fi pitches from humans because they can't identify whether the submissions are coming from humans or are generated by artificial intelligence. So it is a kind of artificial intelligence system that is really impacting all sectors: economy, finance, law, etc. And that is the kind of artificial intelligence systems that I want to kind of talk about. Also, to be super clear, artificial intelligence has been a research that's been around since 1950s. It has come in different waves, in different kinds. In general, artificial intelligence means algorithmic systems, the way we are going to automate various forms of reasonings, various forms of cognitive functions. But the sort of artificial intelligence that kind of ignited the current revolution is generative AI. So most of my talk is going to be about this generative AI. Okay, so when you look into the two kind of articles in the lower part of this slide, you see that there is this kind of discussion between like some people wanting to talk about existential risk. These technologies are going to result in human extinction, one interpretation of existential risk from artificial intelligence systems. And the more like straightforward people talking about how these technologies are really impacting everyday functioning of the world. For example, how we can generate malicious content by the use of this generative AI, how we can amplify the propagation of misinformation and disinformation in an already polarized world, and etc. So there are these two languages of talking about risks. One is like this technology resulting in human extinction. The other one is more straightforward risks. And so I want to kind of bridge these two kind of like discussions or talks. On the one hand, we have existential risks. On the other hand, we have ethical risks. I actually generated this image some days ago by just prompting ChatGPT, because now it can also produce images if you are a pro user. So basically, I just asked ChatGPT to draw a bridge. On the one side of the bridge, there are people who want to talk about ethical risks. And on the other side of the bridge, there are people who want to talk about existential risks. And this came out in 5 or 10 seconds. And I think I personally do not have the capacity before this to generate such a thing in 5 seconds. So that's one kind of use case of this. Okay, but what are these risks, right? So if we have, or if as citizens we are hearing about these two different kinds of risks, different communities talking about risk in this weird languages like existential risk versus other kinds of or non-existential risk, what are these risks? So there are two narratives. The first one are the risk of the technologies here and now. For example, look at this image. It's coming from Twitter or X-Tweet, the Twitter now known as X, from November 5th. And this is generated by a generative AI. Someone has prompted something. We don't know what is that prompt, but you see how fantastic is this image, because if you look at it from different perspectives, you see two kinds of images. The first one is this realistic image of a soldier walking in a war zone. And on the other, from another perspective, you see two faces of men who are kind of trying to talk to one another. And this is generated by just writing one prompt, complicated prompt, and prompt means the text you give to a system that generates images, and that generates such a thing. And before these generative AI systems, we needed to have interesting artists, very unique artists, very few people in the world who could generate such a thing. But now these systems are available to everyone in the world. They can prompt. If you have the art to prompt properly, ask for the right thing from the system, it is going to generate such a thing. It's kind of impressive. Then I asked ChatGPT to write me a 12-line poem thanking the organizers of AI and Media Navigating the Revolution for inviting me. Probably if I personally wanted to write this poem, it would take me I don't know, some days or some hours. But this poem kind of came out in a couple of seconds, and this is what ChatGPT generated. To those who helm this grand affair, AI and Media Navigating the Revolution with care, a heartfelt thanks I wish to share for the invite to this gathering rare. In the dance of code and stories, we challenge, inspire, and leave us richer in thought, eager to achieve. Your stage where future and present meet, sparks conversations both profound and sweet. In gratitude, my words repeat for this chance to learn, grow, and greet. So these are two examples of the sort of content you can generate by these AI systems. And it really empowers a lot of people. Artists can do things with it. Non-artists can also do a lot of things with it. They can generate all kinds of content, all kinds of information. It's going to revolutionize education, the way we search, many different sorts of information, etc. But also it is going to kind of have some negative impacts, right? So we are starting to see examples of these negative impacts from the use of this ChatGPT. This is one example. In March 2023, a couple months ago, there was a Belgian man who died by suicide. We still don't know about the complications of his death, but one of the reasons for his death was the exchange with a chatbot. And people are doing a lot of investigations to exactly understand what was the reason. But we know that after this man was chatting with this ChatGPT technology, after a while, it started that ignited him, among other things, to commit suicide. So on the one hand, we have these kind of systems that help us to do interesting things, to learn faster, to become much more productive, to kind of do literature reviews, to write essays. But on the other hand, we also see this kind of negative impacts of technology. And this is one example of ethical risks, the sort of risk that a lot of people consider as ethical risk. And this is a risk that Due to the kind of realistic content that is generated by the systems, a lot of humans kind of start trusting the systems. And when you gradually develop trust in the systems, you kind of become addicted to the system. And that is a question of like, what is happening to us as this like independent humans who previously would develop trust in truthful sources, but now due to the involvement of these technologies in our lives, we are going to develop trust in these other kind of things. So one kind of ethical risk is the risk of over-trust on this kind of technologies due to the fact that these technologies are becoming more and more accessible to people. And the thing is that a lot of people ignore not using this technology. So they say, okay, like, or they think that they are very autonomous, they're not going to use these technologies, they're going to ignore. But there are some interesting statistics that showing that those people also gradually see the power of these technologies in doing some of the activities more productively, especially in the English language. Most of these technologies are developed in English originally, but now they're adapting it for other languages. And so that is one example of the ethical risk. Now, another example of this, which is actually a very important example of ethical risk called malicious use of this technology, is when this technology is used by people who have malicious intent in order to do some cyber crimes. These kinds of cyber crimes can take many different forms. Here are like two examples of this, the use of a ChatGPT style generative AI for doing cybercrime very actively and also like very sort of like in a cheap way. So one of these technologies is called WarmGPT. And this is a generative AI tool that was brought to attention in July this year by /Next. And then people realize that this is a technology very much like ChatGPT. It has learned so many things from internet, but there hasn't been any filter on this technology. So it has also learned all of the negative or all of the content that we don't want a useful generative AI technology, like we as people who think they have good intentions for those generative technologies, AI technologies to produce. So there are a lot of discussions about whether WarmGPT is just an uncensored sort of conversation, whereas ChatGPT is a censored sort of conversation, or whether it is a system to be used by malicious actors. But there are a lot of investigations, especially on the dark web and etc. People are trying to look into how WarmGPT is being used by a lot of people in order to launch business email compromise attacks and very similar things. So there's a lot of discussion happening now around the impact of this technology. But another system called FraudGPT, this system is trained on a lot of information, a lot of data coming from the kind of like fraud exchanges, like between humans, when a human would receive a fraud email and would be tricked, would be deceived by it. The technology learns from huge amount of data about these sorts of exchanges and then can produce fraud outputs. So there's a lot of discussions about the misuse or malicious use of this technology in order to intentionally cause harm in the cyberspace. Okay, this is a second example of ethical risk. And the third example of this ethical risk, again, the risk of the impact of these technologies on events for here and now, is the way these technologies are going to radically shift the labor market. So this is a paper that was published by OpenAI, the company that pushed ChatGPT first, and I think they are probably the company who are doing the most advanced work on the production of generative AI technologies. So in this paper, the authors some of them are employees at OpenAI, some of them are from outside, academics, and they looked into the potential implications of language models, one variant of generative AI, on the US labor market. So they just look into the US labor market. They look into many different kinds of sectors, and they did a lot of analysis, and they thought that in a lot of sectors, especially jobs that require cognitive work, between 47 to 56% of those jobs are going to be impacted by this generative technology in the next 2 to 3 years. And that's like a lot. And then these are jobs like coding, like software development. These are things that typically or traditionally we would think are the jobs that are being done by humans, and like very smart people can do software coding. But now actually those jobs are now probably, at least parts of them, are going to be automated by these technologies. Of course, for advanced versions, you always need a human, and there are things that this technology still can't do. But this technology were introduced to the world in November 2022, like a year ago. And so we can just speculate that in the next 2 years, if they are being developed, more and more advanced versions, more and more specific versions will be developed. So the third kind of risk of harm is just this kind of shock being given to the labor market. I mean, in the US, United States, like the most powerful political economic force in the world. And so we can imagine all of the other countries that maybe in a direct or indirect way might be impacted by this technology. Such possible kind of chaos might be kind of generated. Okay, so I hope that this kind of risk makes sense to all of us, right? These are the risks of these technologies that we might observe in the next 2-3 years. We are seeing the risk of this by like the malicious use of these technologies now. We are seeing misinformation, propagation, amplification of that on social media by these systems. Again, these problems always existed, but these technologies just amplify them, make them much more accessible to people. Okay. But then there's this other kind of risk that probably like all of us who've been more applied would have heard less about. In philosophy, there were a couple of philosophers, a couple of specific artificial intelligence researchers who would talk about this, but this language has become so much prevalent since kind of like last year. And I want to now talk a little bit about this kind of risk, and then the relation between this sort of existential risk to the sort of risk that I mentioned like earlier. Okay, why we should think about this risk seriously, and by that I don't mean that we should think it's real, but just to have and develop a critical perspective on this. And it's totally fine to completely ignore the language of existential risk and saying that like this language of existential risk is distracting us from paying attention to the real world risk of AI. But it's just the language that is being pushed outside by the most kind of impactful American, British AI research labs. And I think personally that this language is going to become much more prevalent in the next couple of years. So it's kind of good to think about that notion and think how we conceive it, how we understand it. So Google DeepMind is a very impactful company. I work at it for some months, and they do a lot of, they want to kind of push the boundaries of science by AI. One of the most impactful things they've had is the development of this algorithmic system or AI system known as AlphaFold. And this technology, according to a lot of people who are specialized structural biologists, developmental biologists, is a technology that will help them to speed up the drug discovery processes. So they kind of, it's a very complicated AI system. I don't know about the details. I'm not a biologist, but just listening to how experts talk about it, a lot of them think that this technology is going to revolutionize the way we are doing drug discovery, and like we can find like fascinating solutions to some of the diseases that we don't know how to handle. But the company DeepMind, who is producing this kind of very impactful, meaningful AI systems, has its vision that they are trying to develop artificial general intelligence, right? And artificial general intelligence is this technology that is so powerful that might resolve or might kind of increase the existential risks. So existential risk is a notion that is tied not to simple AI systems, but to artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence. And OpenAI, again, the forefront of generative AI, they have this kind of mandate in their whole program that we are going to build artificial general intelligence. Like whether this is meaningful or not, whether this is just a marketing phrase or not, this is a thing that is there. And then these companies are going to compete because one of them wants to prove to the world that they are the people who first will develop this artificial general intelligence. And then Microsoft, which is a company that never talked about existential risk and artificial general intelligence until last year, now is talking about doing experiments. And some of the researchers, like the director of machine learning research at Microsoft, co-authored this paper titled Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence, Early Experiments with GPT-4. Okay, like very kind of ambiguous terminology here, but basically in this paper, they say, look, we give this kind of definition of intelligence. It's not perfect, but it kind of makes sense. And then even GPT-4, which is a technology that ChatGPT is running on, kind of is showing us some sparks of artificial general intelligence. So artificial general intelligence, this very powerful technology, these companies think if they build artificial general intelligence, humanity's problems would be resolved. Like very, very interesting, like sociological and philosophical questions in this whole space, but that is a narrative they're pushing forward. We are going to build artificial general intelligence. It's very powerful. It's going to benefit all of humanity. That is a narrative they put forward. But then the risks that come out from this artificial general intelligence are not the simple risks that I talked about before, like malicious use, risk of automation, or the risk of like biases and etc., or misinformation propagation. It's like this new kind of risk, which is very serious, and they label it as existential risk. Okay, yeah, there's been this a couple of letters that has been written, so like people trying to bring attention to the importance of these kinds of technologies or that risk that fall from these technologies. And the UK government loves this language of existential risk. There are a couple of countries and governments that absolutely dislike this language, but this UK government loves this language, is putting it forward, and they talk about artificial general intelligence in a way that it seems like to them it makes a lot of sense. Extinction from artificial general intelligence is a meaningful thing. And in the UK, there was this huge AI safety summit where people talked about existential risk at the beginning of November. There's a lot of pushback, just to be very clear, about the use of this language from civil society, from academia. But again, that's like an ongoing battlefield. Okay, so what is this kind of weird risk? Like it seems like we have these technologies, like these algorithmic systems, and suddenly they kind of question human extinction. What does that mean? Where does it come from? Again, coming from like philosophy, two philosophers in particular, Nick Bostrom and Toby Ord, have written about this topic since like 20 years ago. Nick Bostrom in particular, and so they say there are these risks that lead to the destruction of humanity's potential. Right? And by that, they mean either humanity's extinction or unrecoverable collapse or unrecoverable dystopia. And then these are some of the examples they refer to. So for example, if a pandemic kills everyone, this is not AI related. Existential risk can happen from all kinds of, it can have different origins, natural or AI. But here are the three kind of ways in which we can think about existential catastrophes and the risk of this existential catastrophe or existential risks. So the first is like humanity's extinction. Imagine 7 billion people are living, like 7.5 billion people are living in the planet. Pandemic kills everyone, human extinction. The second one, pandemic kills, let's say 7 billion, so we have 500 million left. But that causes like permanent collapse. It's kind of hard to bring out the civilization, historical, cultural civilization. And the third one, unrecoverable dystopia. This is what they mean by dystopia. For example, people decide to lock in and never expand beyond the solar system. So it's very interesting. The demographics of people who push for this kind of narratives are mostly Western people, mostly men, coming from very, very specific kind of background, either working or pushing forward the CEOs of these labs, or working in some specific universities like University of Oxford or Stanford. I mean, again, the network is now expanding because this narrative very much attracts attention, right? Existential risk, etc. But that is where this is coming from. And for me, when I started reading this, it sounded super weird. And for some time, just to be very clear, I really tried to ignore this whole narrative. But the problem is that this whole narrative is coming to the public. It is triggering a lot of attention. I've been to like some events where people you would never think would buy into this narrative. They talk about this narrative so easily. So what I want to do then is just to say, okay, if this narrative makes sense, we need to bring it back and root it in the typical ethical risks. So we should not kind of distract attention from those risks, risk of misinformation, automation, and actually an accumulation of those risks can result in these existential scenarios. And for me, that's like a practical, maybe strategic move, but like that's the way to go. Okay, so these two books, if you want to read about like this whole existential risk, like language, are the books that kind of push this idea outside. And again, when you start reading, there are a lot of like weird sentences that just like at the surface level do not make sense. Like this guy called Eliezer Yudkowsky, he is a person that very much pushes for this language, and then he has this like a lot of followers. He writes a lot as well, and then he says things like AGI is going to kill everyone, and he's just bringing attention to this kind of like scenario. But then how can these two sorts of risk be related to each other? Now, one thing to become very clear about is that people who push for the existential risk narrative, they are in positions of power in industry and in academia, and they are attracting a lot of attention and also a lot of resources being allocated to their research, because they want to say like, these are very serious risks, the risk of existential risk. Give us money, we try to help do research and reduce those risks. And the people who think about like more kind of here and now risk of malicious use, human-computer interaction, automation harms, feel like they're kind of left aside, right? Now, the idea there is that actually maybe we should not think that these two sorts of risk are independent from one another. That is the current narrative. We can think that this existential risk emerged from an accumulation and aggregation of ethical risk. And maybe that's the way we have to think about existential risk. So like how to think about it, I think we can just with a stretch of imagination, imagine where these kinds of systems are being misused globally, if they are access to a lot of people. And then there's a lot of like systemic problems in the world. I mean, we're seeing more and more of financial, economic, political problems, polarizations. I mean, in the UK, a very clear observation of that, United States, more and more European Union and the rest of the world. And then when all of these kind of systems or the problems are impacted by misinformation generation, by automation, losses in the labor market and problems in the labor market and the malicious users, we can go to this to this state of chaos, and that state of chaos can be thought to be a state of existential catastrophe. And so that's a way maybe that we have to think about this notion of existential risk. Okay, quickly, 3 practical implications of this. One is that maybe we have to kind of go over this kind of dichotomy of ethical risk versus existential risk, which is a dichotomy that exists in a lot of labs and a lot of research areas. And so we should think that actually these are closer to each other, much more than we think. The second thing is that there's a lot of research, people trying to quantify existential risk. There's this whole business of forecasting, prediction, industry, and maybe I think if we think that this existential risk emerged from ethical risk, we would do those kinds of quantifications slightly differently, at least some parts of it. And then the third one is that there is a lot of efforts, again, in the United Kingdom, and I think more and more in the world, where people are trying to establish new centers, research centers, entities where they focus on existential risk. We have a lot of research centers that are doing work on ethical risk, and these are independent. And then I think the thought here is that actually these two centers shouldn't be shouldn't be separated from one another, and we should think together about this risk rather than prioritizing one type of risk over another. Yeah, and thank you so much for your attention.